Prior to joining Osler as a special advisor, Stephen was the 9th governor of the Bank of Canada. Stephen was the governor for the bank for 7 years, after previously spending 14 years there, occupying a range of senior positions. Prior to joining the Bank of Canada, Stephen spent 14 years at Export Development Canada as chief economist, head of lending, and finally president and CEO. He also spent 4 years at BCA Research, where he was managing editor of the International Bank Credit Analyst, one of the flagship publications. So thank you for joining us today for a very timely and very important conversation, Stephen.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Nicole. Thanks.
Thank you. So we're now 7 months into a global reality that most of us never would have thought we'd be here. Our world is changing. We have economic and financial challenges, and just planning for the future at a time when things are still so uncertain are challenging. So during this VLC, Stephen's going to share some of his views on navigating through this unknowable, including the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on globalization and the Canadian economy. And one of the great things with Stephen is you're known for translating complex and dynamic economic and market information into something that we can actually all understand. So we're very much looking forward to that.
Well, I'll do my best.
Excellent. Well, before we get started, I also want to invite another familiar face onto the screen. Mr. Greg Martino is here.
Good afternoon, Nicole. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon. Now, Greg, going to be staying on the line with us in the background, and you're going to be playing Carla's role by facilitating some of the questions that come in live on the chat function.
Yes, I'll be facilitating the questions. I'm actually looking forward to hearing from Stephen, our special guest. Certainly, you know, the health and wellness of the economy has an impact on what we do with respect to valuation of real property. So it'll be interesting to get some of the insights from Stephen and help inform what we're looking to do from a valuation perspective. So it'll be exciting.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Greg, for helping us out here, and we'll be calling on you in a few minutes. So Stephen, let's begin with you giving a bit of background on your previous roles as the former governor of the Bank of Canada and how these roles positioned you to provide the insights that you do today about the current economic environment that we're all facing with this pandemic.
Well, thanks, Nicole, and thanks for having me on today. This is a fun thing to do. Well, I've always been an economist. I've been an economist for, a really, really long time now. But the two major roles that I've played, both at EDC and at the Bank of Canada, have been an accumulation of experience through thick and thin, if you like, good times and bad times. I think the common denominator that I've really relied upon is contact with the real sector, the real people who make real decisions in the real economy, and that's companies. Okay, so that's something I put a lot of effort into while I was at EDC. You know, I instituted back then a series of executive roundtables where I would have either breakfast, lunch, or dinner whenever I was in a town, which I was allotted. I was in, you know, maybe 20, 22, 23 cities twice a year across Canada. And in each of those, I would normally have a roundtable, some executives, and just ask them, well, what's going on? I'd tell them first what I thought, and they'd react to that. And they'd tell me, you know, that's not how we see it. Well, we're seeing this or we're seeing that. Became very valuable sets of conversations. And when I came to the bank, came back to the bank, I continued those conversations. There weren't as many of them, but what we did also was beef up our, what we call the Bank Outlook Survey, or the Business Outlook Survey, sorry, BOSS, which put a lot more emphasis on that anecdotal information that we could gather. And so a little less of theory and data sets and a little more on the anecdotal, I think, served us well in some times where the models really couldn't deal as well as you had hoped with the kind of circumstances that we were running into. So that's been kind of a progressive thing for me, and I think it's serving us well today, especially when really the data can't really tell you much about what's going on. They can tell you something, but you know there are shortcomings in the data. And so talking to real people, well, that helps quite a lot. So keeping up those conversations and understanding things, and of course, I think one of the important ingredients to that is a sense of transparency that kind of comes with it. So the bank, while I was there and still today, continues to grow its transparency. different channels, talking to different people, so that I think the level of understanding of what the Bank of Canada is doing, and for that matter, government more generally, is higher today than it was years ago. And I think that's an important element of the trust that people develop with the financial institutions, with the financial sector, with government policies.
It's so important. Transparency is something that we take very seriously at MPAC, and the consultations, as you say, that's talking to real people. I mentioned at the opening of this that we have our municipal liaison group. We're talking to the people who are making decisions at the table in municipalities. Greg, who you're going to hear from in a few more minutes, one of the biggest parts of his job is having these consultations with industry groups and stakeholders. And we're going to need to do even more of that in this pandemic to really understand, as you say, what is happening with the businesses and the industries that, with this pandemic and how it's all changed.
Right. Exactly. Well, look at the economic data. We rely very much on, understanding how big of a shock we're going through and where are the most impacted areas and which aren't. And let's take something really simple like retail sales, a very important indicator for your business, for understanding the economy as a whole. And an important difference here is that retail sales in Canada is not the same as retail purchases in Canada. You'd think they might be the same, but there's a big wedge between them, and that is all the stuff you bought on Amazon during the pandemic doesn't show up as a Canadian retail sale. Okay, so it's Amazon's data. Amazon doesn't even break it down between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It's just North America. And that gets sorted out 4 times a year when StatsCan publishes the quarterly national accounts. So you get a better reading on consumption spending. But when you get retail sales, it's lacking a really important factor. It's getting e-sales from Canadian retail sellers, but not the big number that we're all focused on, the one from Amazon as a great example. So that's just one example, and I could go on and on. The data, we think they sound like a perfect snapshot of what's going on. They're more like approximations. Some are fuzzier than others. And the picture really only comes into focus through time as we accumulate more information. And of course, it's well after the fact when we finally do understand what's been going on.
No, you're speaking our language, because this is exactly the types of questions we're having. We look at the retail sector, and it was already changing pre-pandemic. Right. And now we move into the pandemic, and we love our data. We're always looking at data, but you're right, we need to supplement it with the conversations so that we can get the timely information as well. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to ask you a question that's probably on everyone's minds, and that is, will the economy ever financially recover from this pandemic, and if so, when?
Well, the answer is certainly it will. The answer to the second part of the question of when is a harder question to answer because, of course, the underlying assumptions are changing every day. I mean, by now I thought we would have been done. I figured 6 months, 7 or 8 months would be plenty for us to go through this and get down the other side. And of course it was, but now the second wave is proving to be quite significant. And even though we've learned a lot over the course of that, there still is some degree of, let's say, more highly targeted shutdowns going on. And we don't really know how far that's going to end up going. But just to give you a sense, like back in the spring, when we basically shut down pretty totally, I mean, it felt like you shut down everything. Mm-hmm. And the economy went down quite a lot, of course, as a result of this, but it went down 19% to its low point. So it's interesting that when you shut down 100%, seems like it, I know it's not literally true, you only go down 19 or 20%. And that low point was in April. And then the economy began to grow again in May. And so you just put up a graphic, I don't know if people can still see it, which is my favorite, which is the K-shaped. It's not much a K-shaped recovery, but a description of what the economy is going through. And the top part of the K is kind of the V-shaped recovery that we all hope for. And that's true for a significant part of the economy. And then the bottom part of the K is the part of the economy that's still suffering and is actually continuing to suffer and get worse. Now, the bottom part of the K is all the things you're used to hearing about. That's, of course, in the hospitality sector, all the bars, restaurants, hotels. It's going to be in air travel for sure, maybe travel more generally. And it's going to be in certain key sectors such as the energy sector, which you're hearing about. Okay, a lot of it upstream, exploration and so on, but in general, the energy sector is suffering with low prices. So those things are in that bottom part of the K. Now, the good news is that the top part of the K is roughly 95% of the economy. In fact, the economy over the course of the summer has gotten back to about 95% of where it was back in February before all this started. And the other 5% is what we're hearing most about. It's quite naturally the case. It's where all the stresses are. And some of that may end up being very long lasting. It's going to be a tough grind to get back to normal. And some of it could be permanent in some parts, all right? So that's the hard part to figure out. It's going to be hard on people. And this is where policy needs to be focused, and that is on helping those people, both supporting their incomes now and helping them to transition into a growth area of the economy through time.
That's amazing. I just want to pause on a couple things that you said. First of all, you're right. It felt like we were shut down. We were only going to the grocery store and the pharmacies, and it only went down 19%. Like you don't hear, I never read that at all in the media. And to hear that we've actually recovered 95% is very encouraging.
Well, no, not only did we come back nicely, in fact, as I mentioned before, that we have retail sales data. The retail sales data show that the most recent point, which is September, where not only have we recovered all of retail sales from the big downside, the V is complete, and the level of retail sales is almost 2% higher than it was in February. Now, okay, and that doesn't include all the stuff you bought from Amazon. Okay, so we know that the consumer is engaged, right? And so one of the mistakes that economists have made in the past, like they made the same mistake after 9/11, which was a similar traumatic event. And I can remember at that time I was a chief economist at EDC, and I can remember the almost 100% consensus around the idea that people will never travel again. So there's going to be a really long, slow slog for the economy, the global economy, to come back. Well, now we look back on that and we notice right away that the global economy actually picked up speed after 9/11. So why is that? Well, I think the basic question economists need to ask is, if people never travel again, what will they do with the money? And we don't necessarily go out in the backyard and dig a hole and put it in there, right? Well, sometimes people will, not literally perhaps, but they'll save the money. If they save the money for a rainy day or whatever, then of course there's extra caution and there'll be less growth in spending. So far, that's not been the case because government's programs to act as a backstop for people's income have been very well targeted and very effective. So consumption spending seems to have held up really well. So I think it's an important lesson that we learned in the aftermath of 9/11. I mean, today, you know, that if we had a 15-minute check at the airport to make sure that we're COVID free before we got on the plane, people would be traveling again in no time, you know. And so that would be an important return to normal for at least some respects, at least let's say, for pleasure travel. For business travel, I got a feeling some of this will be permanent. Like, look what we're doing right now. I mean, the idea of what I used to do is to fly to Riyadh. You know, as the last international meeting I was at was in Riyadh, and it took me, you know, well over 24 hours, like 24 hours or something to get there. And I was only going to be there for about a day, like roughly one day of meetings. And it was a G20 meeting and then come back. And so surely if you're in business and traveling around, you'd be thinking, well, I think we can do all the negotiations on this deal by Zoom or Skype or whatever our favorite our web tool is. And then we're just going to fly over to London to have the champagne at the end. So there could be a permanent effect, right, on the demand for business travel, for example, and therefore a permanent effect on the demand for jet fuel, and therefore less oil overall being used, and of course complications for the travel sector. But I think there's such an ingrained wish to go visit your friends or go visit places that I think that's a force of nature, which is much harder to suppress and can't be substituted really with the tool like we're using right now. So we'll see. I mean, I don't want to be the one to make these predictions. I'm just saying these are suggested things that we need to understand as we go forward. If we commute less because of this tool, if we work from home more on average forever, perhaps because we've demonstrated that it's good for people and it's good for companies, not always, but a higher percentage of the time. Well, maybe we will need less floor space downtown. Maybe we'll need therefore fewer food courts, that serve those people. We'll need less investment in the expressways, the Don Valley Parkway, or whatever you take to get to work. Well, you're Pickering, I guess. So you take the 401 though.
401.
Something like that. So maybe there's a whole shift in how things shake out. Well, we really don't know.
No, it's so true. And I've always said, let this not be for nothing. So if we've learned some good practices and things work a bit better, and sometimes these virtual meetings are good and they are convenient, but you're right, that connection, that team building, I think all organizations are missing that. And then of course there's the personal connection with your friends and family and wanting to travel. So it will be interesting as we all build our new habits once the pandemic starts to lift.
Right.
I want to go back. You started to speak a bit about 9/11, and I think history is really important and what we can learn from history. And some are calling this the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. So curious what your thoughts are about that, and any comparisons, and even with the 2008 recession that we went through.
Yeah, so I think the people are looking for a sense of drama when they make a comparison with the Great Depression. I personally resist that comparison. And even so far, there's quite a big difference between today and the 2008 episode. But let's start with the 1930s. Well, and just recessions or depressions in general, they're behavioral things. So what happens is something happens in the economy that's negative. Some people may lose their jobs. They spend less money. And by spending less money, that has an effect on other parts of the economy. And that causes some other people to lose their jobs. And your next door neighbor loses their job, you start getting nervous about your job. And so you kind of get this spreading of concern. And people don't literally put money in a hole in their backyard, but they get a little tighter. They worry a little bit about the future. Well, that's clearly a behavioral cycle. It's about sentiment and how people are feeling about the future. Well, what we've been through here is not like that at all. What we did was we turned the economy off, and then we turned it back on again. And so it's more mechanical. And what really drives that cycle of sentiment is income. If you've lost your job, you lose your income. If your income is fully supported or partially but significantly supported, well, then you can continue on like before. You're more careful about your spending because perhaps it's not a full income replacement, but you still continue. And so that's, of course, what policy's been targeted at. And as I indicated, spending is even higher than it was before the pandemic. And savings is higher too. People have saved a lot of money besides. So there's a big difference between that and what happened in 2008, that's for sure. And there's definitely a huge difference between that and what happened in the Great Depression. So I don't like comparisons to the Depression, or for that matter to what we call now the Great Recession of 2008, 2010. We don't know that we even have a recession in that sense yet. So far, all we've seen is basically the mechanical part. And we have a great opportunity with good policies to continue to buttress, to keep the economy resilient and get us across this ditch. All we need to do is bridge ourselves to the point where quick testing and follow-up is much better, and of course, where the vaccine becomes real. Now, and I know that sounds like I'm being theoretical about it, and there's real people who are suffering, so I don't wish to minimize that in any way. But I do think it's important that we keep our perspective. If 95% of the economy is behaving more or less normally, well, let's take some heart from that and know that we began this in a much better position than we did back in 2008. The economy was at full employment. Unemployment was the lowest it had been in 40 years back at the beginning of this year. And inflation was right on target. So everything was as it should be. So just as a healthy individual has a much better chance of shaking off COVID-19, a healthy economy like we had back in last winter has a better chance of being resilient and shaking off COVID too. And what we know about healthy economies is that when there are permanent effects like the ones we've been talking about at the bottom part of the K, it's all about how quickly do you adjust to it? How do you transition? So if there's fewer people taking flights, let's say, then maybe business flights, right? Like we talked about before, then maybe there'll be fewer flights and there'll be fewer flight attendants in that line of work. So what are people doing with the money? Well, it looks like so far they're mostly spending it on their house or buying a new house or whatever. So they're doing what they did after 9/11, which is to feather their nest. It makes them feel more comfortable if they spend their money on their house because they're spending more time there. And so if that's the case, then perhaps the person who's had a career in a restaurant business, maybe we will have less demand for eating out. Maybe there will be fewer restaurants when this is over. I really don't know. But if there were, where should those people try to transition to? Well, they don't have to learn how to write code in order to transition to a new job. But there are great careers in interior design and renovations, or for that matter, just simpler things like maintenance of furnaces and so on, like anything related to houses. There's really hard to get people to come and do stuff right now because of the demand. And so there's lots of room to grow in that sector. And you don't need, like I said, to be able to write computer code in order to learn the skills that go with those jobs. So I'm pretty optimistic that the economy can adjust when it's geography, like Alberta, and to a certain degree Saskatchewan also. Alberta in particular is suffering. Well, they may end up having to have some out-migration, perhaps. I don't know again, but that's another possibility, and we should have the tools to make it easier, less risky for people to move around the country. Today, the individual who's thinking about moving from Calgary to Kitchener or someplace because of a job opportunity, they take all the risk. Okay, and that's a big move for the family, but they take all the risk. And one of the big problems is their spouse might have a really good job in Calgary. They could be working for a hospital or something. They've got a good job. So do you move the whole family and take a double risk? In our system, all you get is a tax deduction for your moving costs. I mean, it's not really a strong incentive to take all that risk, right? So I think there are things we could do there to increase mobility and the elasticity of our ability to adapt.
No, it's amazing. It's amazing actually as you draw so many comparisons of our behavior with recessions and as you say, the fear factor or the feathering of the nest. Those I think they resonate with all of us. So it's really interesting. Now, the other thing you mentioned a few moments ago is how the government really has put a backstop in. So they've been supporting people, they've been supporting local businesses. I think a question that is on a lot of people's minds is how sustainable is this and what is it going to do? Are we going to be paying taxes now for the rest of our lives to try and get ourselves out of this? So curious on your thoughts on the debt that we're incurring.
Yes, everybody's asking this question, Nicole. It's a good one. We need to be asking that question. We need to have answers to that question. But I'll offer some insight, if not an answer. And so let's begin with the IMF's latest reporting just about 10 days ago forecast the fiscal situation for the world. And what they show there is they expect government debt late this year or in early 2021 to converge on about 100% of GDP. That's all governments, all government debt around the world. So global GDP, global government debt. Now here in Canada, we know, well, we started this whole thing at 30% or so of GDP for federal government debt. But of course, we're doing some things now which are going to incur some debts, and of course, provinces should be considered as part of that as a bundle. So we too in Canada are approaching the 100% level. So it's not so different from the United States. So a little bit better than the U.S., but not in a different league. And so 100% of GDP, well, that sounds like a huge number, but it's roughly the same number that we had as debt globally just after World War II in 1945. So I like to ask baby boomers, I'm not asking you this, of course, but I'll ask myself, okay? And I like to ask people who are around my age, do you remember when you're growing up as a kid in the 50s and 60s? Do you remember the debt burden? Do you remember what that felt like to be growing up with this overhang of debt that had to be paid off from the war? Nobody thinks of that at all. No one has ever thought of that. And ask yourself, well, why? Because we just grew out of it. We grew the GDP enough that the debt service on that debt, became trivial through time. We never literally paid it back. It's in there and it gets renewed and all that sort of stuff. It's part of the stock. So that's an important piece of perspective, I think, right? So I mean, really, would you say, well, what we should do is not spend any money from now on because we've got to pay back this debt, and leave the legacy to our kids of all the crumbling bridges and falling down schools and highways that full nothing but potholes and airports that don't work? Is that the infrastructure that's really bad? Is that what we should do? And that's better. So, but there wouldn't be as much debt? I don't think so. Okay. So really what needs to be done here, and the government is well on this, and it's well understood, is to ensure that as much as possible, these resources are being spent on things that are growth enhancing. So what matters is the infrastructure investment that they're making, is it going to facilitate new growth in the economy? And here I would mention not just physical infrastructure, which is really important, digital infrastructure, physical infrastructure like ports and highways and bridges and public transit and all those things, of course, but also social infrastructure. So one of our biggest infrastructure gaps is daycare. And so we look across the country, one province that has done an extraordinary job on this front is Quebec. So they have what looks like an incredibly generous daycare system. And everybody, when they put it in, said, "Oh, this is ridiculously expensive, and that's just a huge giveaway. We'd never be able to achieve that elsewhere." And what has happened is that female labor force participation has gone up tremendously in Quebec over those years and boosted trend economic growth enough that basically that thing is paying for itself. And so I think that's one of the biggest things we could do to improve our growth line, is to increase female labor force participation just by having a daycare system that was like Quebec's, but for the entire country. So this is just one suggestion among many. You could have interprovincial free trade. The IMF estimates that would add 4 percentage points onto the level of GDP if it took 10 years to achieve, which is slow, but let's say it did. That would add 0.4 percentage points onto the trend growth rate in GDP every year. And that's just free money just lying around, really. It's just free money. And we refuse to pick it up over and over, by having, no, it's very important that we not allow somebody to buy beer in Quebec and drive across the border to New Brunswick. I mean, seriously. That somehow is, I don't know, adding to somebody's prosperity. And of course, it's rules like that are slowing us down. And there are many other examples. So those are just a couple of things that can be done. The most important thing here is that the rate of growth in the economy needs to exceed the real rate of interest that we're paying on the debt. And if that's the case, and I have every reason to think it will, even if we don't do these extraordinary things I'm talking about, If long as that happens, then we can grow our way out of this debt overhang. And it'll feel, but to our kids, much like it felt to me when I was in the 50s and 60s. In other words, it'll feel like not much. It'll
Yeah.
be taken care of.
That's why it goes back to a comment you made earlier that a healthy economy will help us shed the virus earlier, right? So, so that's really interesting. On a similar note, do you have any thoughts on our Canadian dollar?
Well, I do. The Canadian dollar has always been kind of an important barometer for how things are going in the world. I would say, when I say always, I mean historically, in the longer history. And that's been very good for us because we depend on the world for our growth through the export channel. That's really important. And of course, commodities or resources are an important part of an indicator of whether the world is recovering or not. So the way it normally would work would be the world economy falls into a recession, the price of resources fall because you're making less stuff. And so, of course, Canada is going to get hurt more than other countries that aren't so reliant on exports. So what happens is the Canadian dollar goes down as kind of a shock absorber, and then that buffers the effect. That's the normal way it works. Well, in 2008, you mentioned that before. Well, it didn't really work that way because what happened was the fiscal expansion that happened almost right away boosted China's economy right away, and resource prices picked up, especially oil. And so the Canadian dollar went up while we had the Great Recession. Okay. And that was unfortunate because it meant not only did we not get the usual buffering effect, it meant that we lost a lot of companies in the export sector. They went out of business during that recession. It was an export intensive recession because of the dollar effect. And since then, it seems what has emerged is the Canadian dollar in the markets is kind of treated as a risk asset, which is like if the world investor community is ready to invest in risk today, stock markets go up and bond prices, of course, go down because interest rates tend to go up and the Canadian dollar goes up. Okay, so now we look back. Well, what has happened here is a great big crater has opened up in front of us because of COVID-19. Policymakers have worked extraordinarily hard and quite effectively to stabilize things, to fill that crater up with liquidity. And that crater is sufficiently full of liquidity that we can actually row our boats across it, right, until the COVID thing goes behind us. And that's an important parable to keep in mind because the interpretation from markets would be, oh, policy's working, so we don't have to go into a crater. And so that's why I think equity markets have been, they haven't been great, right? But they recovered most of their losses, and we're going through uncertainty, of course. But if this really was the biggest recession or as big as the Great Depression, stock markets wouldn't be behaving like that. Okay. And so there's a certain amount of faith there that policy is credible, that it's doing the right thing. And so what has happened then is the Canadian dollar has tended to be a little stronger and not acting in that buffering way as it historically has done when we've had this kind of a situation. So all that to say is it's really hard to make a prediction, and I don't think you were asking me that. You were asking me just for my interpretation. And that's how I interpret how the Canadian dollar has been behaving. And so in a sense, it still is acting as a barometer of the global condition. But I think the global condition is actually better than, the medium is making it look and the way we're hearing it, because it's mostly focused on the 5% of the economy that's in a really challenging situation. And if you kept your perspective and remember the other 95% is actually doing pretty well, then you say, well, okay, I guess it does make sense that the world is, it's got the downside is not as big as it sounds if I'm just focused on the 5%. And so markets are behaving that way, and that includes the Canadian dollar as a barometer of that underlying sentiment.
No, that's really helpful. All of the, as I said at the beginning, you take such complex matters and you drill them down to something in a way that we can all understand. So thank you for that. I think it'd be a good time to do a poll question, because we've talked about a lot of really good topics. And so you'll see a poll on your screen here. So Stephen, all of our almost 2,000 employees from across the province will answer this question. It's anonymous and it's optional. But what are some financial lessons you've learned in the pandemic? So the first answer would be invest in the long term. The second option would be save more. The third option is invest in real estate. The fourth is try not to incur debt. And the fifth, if you want to just share some ideas in the chat function. So Stephen, while we're allowing people some time, a selfish question on our part, and maybe it goes with invest in real estate. What are your thoughts about the impact of the housing market in Canada and Ontario in the long term? We know people are spending more money on their homes, as you say, feathering their nest, and we've seen obviously in the residential market that the transactions and pricing has gone up, but curious on some of your thoughts.
Sure. Well, yes, the core of my thinking of this is that households are more inclined to invest in their home or invest in a home now than before. There are a lot of drivers for that. One would be that incomes have been stabilized by policies through this. But secondly would be interest rates are at the lowest level in a generation. By all accounts likely to remain low for quite some time. And I don't mean in the sense of policy making. That's a debate that anybody could have. But what I mean is in real interest rate terms, inflation adjusted interest rate terms. Interest rates are really low primarily for demographic reasons. That is, that global population has been slowing for a good 20 years now, and it's going to keep slowing down until around 2050, down to about 0% growth per year by then. So over the course of that next 30 years, I expect to see real interest rates continue to be edging lower throughout that period. And so in that sense, it seems to folks who have lived over the last 10 or 15 years that this is a very good time to invest in a home. And of course, that's showing up in the activity we're seeing. Prices are rising maybe more than we might have expected at this stage, but that too, it's important to remember that housing is just like any other asset in the sense that it generates a perpetual stream of services. Think of it as, if you were renting, say at $1,000 or $2,000 per month, the present value of that stream of rental payments today is higher than it's ever been because interest rates are so low, the discount factor that you would use to discount it. And it's the same about the services that you get from housing. The present value of those services is higher than ever before because of low interest rates. So that puffs up the value at the front end, but it's also, of course, because of excess demand, pent-up demand, pent up over the last few months, where there was excess demand before all this started, and all we did was shut things down for a few months. Immigration is a really important driver of this, and immigration, of course, has slowed during the pandemic. But I have every reason to think that as things normalize, we'll go right back to a solid immigration flow. And so I think that housing is going to remain a solid part of all this. In the background, people are becoming unemployed. We know that. There are about 700,000 fewer jobs today than there were in February in Canada. So 1.8 million people roughly are without work. And so there are other arguments you could make that perhaps prices could erode in this environment. That's the normal way we think of it when there's a downturn in the economy. But as I said and argued before, so far this is not a cyclical behavioral recession. We'd have to wait and see if wave 2 we survive it the way we did wave 1. Then I'll stick with my story. If it gets progressively worse, then we may have to think about some softness in the housing market. But right now, it's not part of my thinking.
No, well, thank you for that. And I see we've got the poll results here. It's interesting if you take the try not to incur debt and save more, that it's the bulk of the responses. So going back to the behaviors, are you surprised by some of these results?
Well, in a way I am, but not really. I mean, when uncertainty seems high, it's normally when people do save more. And of course, saving is just the opposite of incurring debt. So they do go together. In fact, what we know is that over the course of the summer and into September, people did save more. On average, in the second quarter, people saved about over 25% of their income. Because so many things were closed, you had nothing to spend your money on, and of course they paid down debts at the same time. So it's kind of, as you said, it kind of goes together. So that's that in a current sense, it's not surprising, and more interesting to think about how long lasting this would be. I mean, if we get the good news, maybe the uncertainty around the US election has people wondering what the future looks like. Well, we don't have to wait a week or so for that. One way or the other, we'll have less uncertainty a week from now, perhaps, unless it's contested, where, financial markets were to firm, and so there's less uncertainty there. And then, some of these things might go down. What I like is invest in the long term, because that's the people who watched the stock market go down, and then hopefully they didn't abandon ship because they got most of the money back if they stayed in the long term. And invest in real estate, because frankly, if we go back to the last time we were in this kind of a situation, really there's a lot of parallels. I mean, there's potential here for some cost push type of inflation, and possibly a rise in the long-term unemployment rate, sort of a stagflation kind of feeling that we could have over the next couple of years. And if you go back to the 1970s, that's the last time we had that real combination. The only asset that did well, there were two: real estate and gold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So maybe I'll ask Greg, to come on, because I know we've got some advanced questions, and I know that this is near and dear to your heart as you're listening to all this, Greg. So
I've been fascinated by the conversation. It's been really interesting. I almost forgot that we also have questions coming in. But just before we go to the questions, some of the other thoughts that have come in through the poll was, the people that actually submitted some thoughts into the chat. No need to buy a second car just because we are working from home and we're doing less travel. Being more conservative with respect to our spending, investing in our own properties. There are a couple of suggestions with respect to putting a pool in the backyard. That's become our vacation spot. Save a little less and spend more now to enjoy time with family, and continue to spend as I normally do, just to keep the economy going. Were some of the thoughts that came.
That's a nice spirit. I like that. Yeah.
So in terms of questions that have come in, and again, because of what it is that we do, we're focused on property valuation. One of the challenges that we have is with respect to capturing market values is the limited number of transactions, particularly on the commercial sector. Do you have any advice as to some of the leading indicators that we should look towards that would probably give us insights as to where property values or property markets are trending?
Yeah, well, that's going to be a hard one, isn't it? And it's certainly one of the areas that we've highlighted in the earlier discussion as a stress point from some of these long-term, potentially permanent changes in fundamentals. Does the average company need as many square feet in the downtown core or wherever their office building is in this new world? My guess is chances are no, that there will be on average a bit of a reduction in the amount of square footage that a typical company needs if they're not growing. Of course, that's an important proviso, because they could be growing. They could be positioning themselves for growth. If they think their growth is going to be, more or less capped, and if half their staff at any given time is going to be working from home and they're going to rotate or whatever their model might be, they may be able to do with less real estate, and that's an important way for the company to save some money. And if you got half as many people downtown on any given day, there's half as many people, going and lining up at the sandwich shop or wherever you like to go down in the tunnel or wherever you go. So there's these secondary effects, and these are all commercial real estate effects. Now within a company, I suppose you maybe need to allow for less dense floor plan. That's a possibility too. And so there is an offset perhaps to the square footage argument. But in any case, that will vary from company to company, but I bet on average, there will be some shrinkage in demand for commercial real estate, and for sure in the services, that are in those buildings. So fewer people to collect rent from. That's kind of where that goes. So I have to believe that in that there might be a sort of at least a temporary a slowdown in prices, or a decline perhaps in prices. Now it's important to remember that the rent curve, this, I'm going to say something here that may be news to economists or politicians, I'm not sure which, but anyway, in any city, the bigger it gets, right, the steeper the rent curve gets, just because of how long it takes to get into the center. Okay, so the time value of money determines what the curve looks like. If there's fewer people commuting on any given day, then that's going to speed up commutes. And so you can have a decline in prices, not just for the reasons that people need less square footage, but just because there's fewer people having to come in every single day. So I think those are the kinds of things you need to be aware of. I don't really know of any leading indicators, except, I think you got to stick with your intelligence. At least talk to the big landlords. That's easy because there's not that many. And find out, what are the stress points telling them? And surely they'd be actually quite interested in having that conversation with you, because I think there's an incentive for everybody to understand well what is happening. And the banks, your banks, they may also have insights, because of course they're hearing the stress story from the opposite perspective, right, from the lessee's perspective. And every one of those people has a bank, and they're letting the bank know they're under stress for rent and so on. And of course, the government too has got a rent relief program, and so an organization like yours ought to be able to get some official information on, where are the stress points the biggest and how big are they, and sort of collect some real-time data that way. So those are what I've got in terms of leading indicators. It's probably a very imperfect business. And of course, could be temporary. We get a vaccine, sometime this winter, and everybody gets their hope back. Then, these kinds of predictions will just fall apart in no time. So, and I'm sure if you're in business, you'd be thinking, well, I kind of like to hang in there because I still think long-term, this is a viable business. So I think policies are aimed at, in a way, just stopping the clock for as long as we need to, so that things can restart afterwards. And that's what's behind bank deferral programs. That's exactly the same thinking. It's like, let's do our best to stop the clock. Stress is high, but there's no need for it to get any higher. If we can get through another 6 months, surely we'll be closer to the end game, and people will be able to make a proper assessment of the business future.
No, that's great. Those are really helpful. I'm sure, Greg, I'm sure you found those helpful. And Greg, I think you have a couple more employee questions. And while you're coming on the screen, Stephen, we've been looking at square footage for our own employees for years now, because we started working from home 7 years ago. Now, it wasn't 100% like we are in the pandemic, but we've slowly shrunk our own square footage by about 25%. But now, once we do start to open back up, and as you say, the vaccine comes in, we'll be making those decisions too, as what does our own footprint look like in the province of Ontario.
Right.
So Greg, over to you.
Sure. Great, thank you. With respect to employee questions, how has the current economic environment impacted registered retirement savings plans and registered education savings plans? Will I get to retire on time, and will my kids' education savings plans be impacted tremendously due to the pandemic? And I think you touched upon this in a previous answer.
Yeah, it's a hard question. People have been saving more. I don't know for sure if they've been saving in those forms, or just letting money pile up in their own bank account. But but whether they're thinking long term yet, which is of course an RESP or an RSP is a long term thought process. And so I think it comes back to a more basic question is like, when is retirement? And that's a pretty broad and difficult question. I mean, we're all living longer. I mean, that's not all of us are living longer. I don't mean, what I mean is the longevity, the statistical longevity in the last 20 years has gone up quite a few years. And so what we do know is that labor force participation in people who are of retirement age has been rising pretty steadily. So we do know that people are opting to remain in the workforce longer, even though they may have a pension plan that allows them to retire and so on. Even people, of course, some people may not have a pension plan, of course, and there's no on-time retirement for them. It's about when do they feel like they can, or they can swing what they're doing. That depends on their savings. And what has happened is their savings have not performed that well, right? It depends on what it's been in. But if they're in traditional kind of interest-bearing kind of assets, then it hasn't performed very well. And so that has, I think, caused a lot of people to put retirement a little bit further down the road. And thankfully, we have, on average, a better health profile so that we're able to do exactly this. And now I can speak from experience that, retirement has been great because I get to do so many different new things. And so it's, I'm still a participant in the workforce. So I just don't know. It's a very personal decision. Societally, it looks like we're starting to work a little bit longer. So retiring on time is kind of a moving concept. If you're thinking about something precise, then I think a lot of rules are changing. Low interest rates are making it as though you need to have a higher present value of savings in order to finance a typical retirement. And so either your pension plan is stressed or your personal savings is stressed. And so on the other side of this is we need labor force participation to continue to grow the economy. So I think it's fantastic that people who are in the retirement age category opt to remain in, even if it's a part-time thing or something like that. That all adds to the growth rate that we need in order to pay for all this.
No, well, that's great. Well, we're happy that in your retirement career, you're able to come and chat with us today. So we're very grateful for that. Greg, I think you had one final question we have time for on sub-zero interest rates that had come in from staff.
Yes, this is related to the Bank of Canada. And do you think the Bank of Canada will ever offer sub-zero interest rates as, for example, the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan currently offer? And what do you think the long-term impacts would be if sub-zero interest rates were offered in Canada?
Yeah, well, that question goes pretty close to the bone there on what I would call current monetary policy questions, and I don't like to get very explicit on those. That's not really fair to my successor or my team. But just a little background is this: negative interest rates. We've seen them in Europe, in particular. We've seen that they have some effect, mostly a signaling effect. But you need to think of it like this. The interest rate most of us think of actually is the 5-year mortgage rate. That's a fairly long rate of interest, right? I mean, when I talk about interest rates, I'm talking about tonight, overnight interest rate. That obviously that doesn't matter at all to a mortgage holder. But of course, they're all kind of linked in the yield curve. And so what QE, quantitative easing, and things like negative interest rates, or what other terms that are used are yield curve control, those tools that are being used by central banks are all attempts to push down not just the short rate of interest, but longer term rates as much as possible to make sure whatever rate you're paying, it's the low as it can be. Okay, so if you could make interest rates as the short end even negative, which theoretically we can, that obviously pushes down like a 5-year rate at a little bit more. So you get an even better deal on your mortgage. So that's the idea of it. It's, but ask yourself the opposite question. If I could lower the 5-year rate by magic by another 15 or 20 basis points, do you really think that would make all the difference to the economic recovery? Well, the reason these are used is they're used in countries like, especially in Europe, because fiscal policy was failing utterly to do anything to get them out of the crater we talked about before. And now they're making a move there. So that's helping tremendously. But in other economies like the US or Canada, it's fiscal that's doing all the work, as it should be when interest rates are already about as low as they can go. So yes, negative rates can do something for you, but very little. Usually central banks use them as a last resort because, you know, if the economy doesn't recover, they're going to ask the central banker, you know, they're always going to blame the central banker. Why didn't you try negative interest rates? And they're not, you know, the answer, well, I didn't think it would work. I didn't think it would have much effect. It doesn't wash very well. What they're going to want to hear is you tried everything in your, you know, every photon torpedo was used. You know, the phasers are completely empty because you've used everything. You can't say, well, I saved one photon torpedo because, you know, I always like to have one in reserve. They're like, well, come on, you should have used it. It's like letting some water stay in the reservoir at the golf course. You have to use it during the dry spell. It'll rain someday, you know? So anyway, I think it's kind of last resort kind of stuff. And when we've got a great fiscal reaction, which we have, then I don't think there's any really benefit to it. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't happen. You know, I don't want to, in theory, it would add a little something.
But I guess to your comment, it being our last resort, if we actually get to that point, things are not as rosy as we would like them to be.
Well, that's exactly right. And, you know, another way to look at it, Greg, is if interest rates were a little bit lower for a little bit longer, is that going to cause more people to take an airplane or go eat in a restaurant?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, where the weak spots are in the economy. We already have a really hot housing market and a renovation market. So do we really need interest rates to do more work? I mean, I don't really see it. So really fiscal and targeted fiscal, which is what's going on. That's the main way that we'll continue to guide ourselves through this difficult period.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was great. Thank you for that. So we're out of time. This was a great virtual leader chat. Stephen, when you and I were doing the prep call last week, you said someone had nicknamed you Sunny Stephen because of your optimism. And I think that you shone through today, because I feel I'm an optimist by nature, but I feel a little bit more comforted and also optimistic about where we're at and the policies that are in place and how the economy is reacting in all of this. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for your time today.
Well, it was my pleasure. I wish you all well, and I'm hoping the property prices continue to go up a little wee bit every year. Makes your job more predictable.
So thank you again, Stephen, for joining us. That was wonderful, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Good. Thanks.
Okay, bye for now.